welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at this webinar organized by LITASA, the Literacy Association of South Africa, entitled Data in Education. And as our blurb on our advertising and social media posts indicated, I think this is an area that is underserved or under-researched in a lot of education circles, because it feels really far away. It feels really futuristic and like an issue that we don't need to worry about now, but I think it is something we do need to consider, given what the lessons that we've learned during COVID, and also, a lot of the learnings that have happened as we realize that we are in fact in the fourth industrial revolution already. So welcome. We have three panelists lined up, and I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion today. Just to indicate once again that we are recording this session, so take note of that. Please feel free to put any comments or questions into the chat area, and we'll be picking up on questions later on in the discussion today. And but please feel free to say hi, introduce yourself, let us know who you are and where you're from. And as you do that, I am going to be introducing our speakers. We have with us Professor Shafika Isaacs, and Shafika Isaacs works as an international digital learning specialist, a community builder, and professional coach who focuses on social and environmental justice, perspectives on digital learning, the fourth industrial revolution, and skills development. She currently serves as an associate professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg. She provides technical support on digital learning and skills development to many global and local organizations, including the NECT, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the Commonwealth of Learning. She also serves as a friend of the Chrysalis Academy and Clear Mind International on wellness leadership programs for youth. She serves on a number of boards and has published widely on digital learning in Africa. Welcome, Shafika. We're also joined by Dr. James Keevy, and James Keevy is an experienced policy researcher that has worked in South Africa, Africa, and internationally for the last 25 years. Following 13 years at the South African Qualifications Authority in research policy and international liaison capacities, he joined JET Education Services in 2014 as the chief executive. His specific areas of expertise include qualifications, the recognition of learning, digitalization, and the professionalization and migration of teachers. He has worked closely with several international agencies, including the OECD, ILO, World Bank, Commonwealth Secretariat, Commonwealth of Learning, the SADC Secretariat, the African Union Commission, and others. He has published extensively, including a mapping study on qualifications for the African Union Commission, as well as a review of the research response in South Africa to the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, James. And finally, we have Jeff Jacobs. Jeff holds a master's degree in economic science from Wits University and an MBA from Wits Business School. Before joining New Leaders Foundation in 2015, Jeff worked at Deloitte Consulting, Johannesburg, as an economics, strategy, and innovation consultant for 4 years. Since 2015, Jeff has held several managerial roles on the Data-Driven Districts, or DDD, or Triple D, as it's commonly known, program, such as the Analytics and Insights Manager, Program Manager, and Chief of Staff. Jeff is currently the Triple D Insights and Innovation Manager, where his main responsibility is to identify, test, and launch actionable data-driven insights for education officials. Jeff is passionate about combining data insights and digital technologies to increase efficiency and impact, especially within the basic education sector in South Africa. Welcome, Jeff. So I think you can see why we chose these speakers and why they have joined us today, because they really have an extensive and broad knowledge of the issue of data in education. And so we are looking forward to a really interesting and robust discussion and presentation today. I think let's jump right in. We will have time for questions and answers later, but let's get straight into the discussion. So I think let's begin with sort of an overview, a big picture. And Shafika, maybe I can bring you in here to ask you, what are the international trends in relation to education and the fourth industrial revolution? And where's South Africa's position? What is our response?
Thank you again to Litasa for organizing this, this conversation, which is proving to be so critical in this moment. And I'm certainly looking forward to, very importantly, also a critical discussion around technologies in education, data in education. And I think also with my fellow panelists, there are similar perspectives around how we tackle this beast called data in education, 4IR in education, and so on. So the reality is, when asked about what are the trends, the truth is that there isn't one view, there isn't one perspective on what the trends are. There isn't one perspective on how this thing called the fourth industrial revolution is unfolding and how it is affecting education. That there are, in fact, I think the first point is that there are a number of different narratives on this very issue. And at the same time, there is a dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative is focused a lot around the affordances and the possibilities that the technologies can do in changing education, in addressing our educational problems. So there's been a lot of writing and positioning around the affordances and the increasing capabilities and affordances of exponential technologies, artificially intelligent technologies, blockchain technologies that are coming onto stream, and the phenomenal potential to address our very deep-seated educational challenges. And there's almost an evangelistic view that all we need to do is invest in technologies and technologies will solve our problems. So that there's a very strong dominant view that that proposes that is in fact practicing that is very prevalent and very large and dominant voice coming particularly from big tech companies who are selling technological products. So it's very much often a solution-based conversation, and the technology solutions are often in the form of technology products that are punted by often big companies, but also edtech startups and so on. So there's been a huge preponderance of the marketization of education and the commercialization of education in the name of edtech. And particularly during the COVID pandemic, when people were confined to homes, also marked a pivot towards remote and digital learning and loud calls for us to bridge the digital divide, to invest in devices and connectivity so that children at home can in fact learn remotely while they're away from schools. So that is still a very much a dominant view. And we've seen that during the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the same time, what that has also done is it's opened up, particularly in spaces like UNESCO, in civil society, and a number of organizations in South Africa, has also opened up a critical perspective on this technological solutionist perspective around, you know, that technologies in themselves can help address our very deep-seated and very complex educational challenges. And there's a growing clamor around the concerns that technological investments are in fact demonstrating already in our education systems worldwide. So the critique is actually also now being led by organizations like UNESCO, who, by the way, is in the process of publishing another publication entitled An EdTech Tragedy, which is a very critical perspective on how this technological rollout and calls and investments have actually played itself out globally to the extent that it's actually led to deepening forms of inequality. Is one of the major critiques, because what we've seen in COVID is a deepening of inequality, but that the investments of new technologies and datafied technologies are actually giving way to new forms of inequality. that we are also beginning to understand. And so that is really a cause for very serious concern, that the more algorithmically and artificially intelligent based technologies are also demonstrating aspects that raise ethical concerns, that raise concerns around infringements on data privacy of students, that are in fact of learners and young people and children, and how that is in fact harvested, how the data is in fact harvested by companies in ways that can extract economic value. And so that has also caused huge concern. The fact that we've also seen the emergence of algorithmic biases, and there've been some examples of how some learning analytics systems have in fact reflected racist and sexist and Islamophobic tendencies in terms of profiling more marginalized communities in the way the data and the way the algorithms have been designed. And the example in the UK in 2020 of the Umalusi equivalent, and what's happened with the use of a learning analytics system and the use of ExamSoft as an exam proctoring system in the US, and how that too has reflected algorithmic biases, has caused huge concern about how that can in fact deepen divisions, deepen inequalities, new forms of inequalities. And so what that means is that we are in fact confronted with a very urgent need to address some of these very fundamental ways in which investments in technologies can in fact raise new problems, deeper problems in our education system. And so when it comes to trends, I think an emergent trend is this call for us to be a lot more critical, to engage in ways that makes the big edtech companies a lot more accountable, to explore what exactly these edtech products that our governments are investing in, how they in fact in deepening inequalities and reinforcing biases, and placing the privacy and the data of our children at risk. And there's almost a sort of, that's really an area that requires significantly more research and work. And I'm hoping that this conversation can also surface ways in which we can do that a lot more better in South Africa. Fortunately for us in South Africa, we've got a very critical civil society, very strong civil society, very strong organizations that have appreciated the unequal terrain in our schooling system. So our COVID response has been such that we've recognized the possibilities that technologies hold pedagogically for our learners and teachers and our schooling system. But at the same time, we've also drawn on older technologies, the value of printed texts, television, radio, community radio, and low-end chat platforms as a spectrum to ensure that we can reach wider layers of society. So I think that that's a very healthy approach. But what is needed is a lot more work around tackling the aspects of new forms of technologies and the new forms of inequalities that they are perpetuating. And therein, we need a lot more research and a lot more work, and it would be useful to hear from the audience as well on ideas in terms of how to tackle that. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I think Jeff and James can certainly add a lot more in terms of their own experiences and how that has influenced the work that they do. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. I think you pick up on several important points there, and one certainly being around capacity. You know, capacity as in understanding how these technologies work and how they can be employed, and then another capacity to critique their use and to understand the potential pitfalls of their use. Yeah, definitely. Jeff and James, did either of you want to come in there?
Good to see a lot of familiar faces. I see Louise, Magali, and others. So, Catherine, let me just quick intro. So thanks, Shafika. You and I always pass in the corridors, but we never had a chance to work together, by the way. In Paris, even sometimes. So just a quick 3 points from my side, Catherine, and maybe to colleagues that I think are important for us to consider where we are as a community internationally, but also South Africa, is our understanding of data interoperability and how different data sets can interrelate in ways that can really be a game changer for us as a country. There's some really interesting stuff happening at the moment, and to Shafika's point around concerns about commercialization, there's also a lot of good things happening in the public sector around understanding how different data systems can actually link together to help us determine the links between supply and demand. In South Africa, our data sets are very siloed. An Umalusi or a SAQA has data, but an employer organization or an employer body or a professional body has a different data set. So I think there's an opportunity if we can start linking those kind of different data sets in a way that we can link supply and demand, can really make a difference for us in the country. So the idea of data interoperability, I think, would be my first idea. My second one would be the notion of credential fluency. And this is the idea where qualifications and the way we've known them for the last 200 years, I think, are changing very quickly into the future. We're seeing learning, micro-learning, and different forms of learning happening much quicker, much more digitally. And we're seeing ways to bring all of these forms of learning together into a package, which we call credentialing in the research we do rather than qualifications. It's the idea of a CV that's electronic and verifiable. You know, for so long, when I submit a CV for a job, half the stuff on the CV cannot be verified. You know, the employer jumps to the qualifications and the rest of the stuff is like, okay, it sounds interesting, but we can't check it. I think we're moving to a world where the full CV can be verified because of the ability for us to, in real time, check the authenticity of the data. Maybe just my third last point around your first question, Catherine, would be around data privacy. It came up a little bit in Shafika's point as well. If we move into this world that is more digital, more electronic, more interoperable, then the next question is data privacy. In the developing world, we've got a very poor track record with data privacy, and particularly with younger learners. There are so many of our commercial LMSs, electronic systems, they simply use that data as if it's their own, and it's not their own data. That data is incredibly sensitive and needs to be managed with care. A lot of our work at the moment with JET and with some of our international clients is around the concept of self-sovereign identity. It's about new forms and new protocols to ensure that the owner of the data manages their own data. Let me use Umalusi again as an example. Shafika kind of triggered my comment. Poor Umalusi, I hope there's nobody from Umalusi here today. But an Umalusi of this world can take our matric certificates and use that data and sell their data as if it's their own. I even need to pay if I want Umalusi to provide my own data back to me or to an employer. That's not the world, how the world's going to pan out in the next 5 to 10 years. In the next 5 to 10 years, my data belongs to me. If Umalusi wants to use my data, they ask me. If an employer wants to verify my data, they ask me first, and I allow or give Umalusi the permission to release the data. And these protocols are now being developed, and SSI is a good example, but there are others that enforce in an electronic way using the blockchain to make sure that these decisions and these transactions happen in a way that I can manage them as the owner of the data. So without making a long story, Catherine, because I wasn't sure how much you wanted me to speak, I think data interoperability is important. I think credentials and understanding a CV as an electronic verifiable portfolio is important. And lastly, I think our new understanding of data privacy is where the world is going. And we're there as South Africa. And perhaps we can talk a bit more about that today. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. Yeah. And I think also what's important is for us to separate out different types of data and the different purposes for collection. So some of it may be related to learning analytics, for example. Some of it may be related to qualifications or credentialing. Others of it can be for research purposes. And I think we also need to differentiate that in our conversations as well. It's important. Yeah. Jeff, do you want to add? I'd like to ask some specific questions around the triple D. So can we go straight there, or did you want to add anything? Okay, cool. We'll go straight there. So maybe, Jeff, because of your understanding and your work with triple D, can you give us an idea of what data is currently being collected in South African schools specifically, and how is that data being used?
Sure. Sure, thanks for the opportunity to participate. I'm definitely punching above my weight with the other panelists, but yeah, it's also nice to see some familiar faces. Just to Shafika's point around global trends and related to what we're seeing on DDD is this idea of tech being a silver bullet. It's maybe a bronze bullet, if I have to put it that way, but it's definitely not a silver bullet. And if you look at international research around data-driven decision-making within education or in other sectors, we're all sort of in the same boat trying to figure it out. There's no country that can say, oh, we've nailed this, we've got this right. They're all investing millions, billions in tech and struggling to see the results. And it's becoming clear that you need a lot of the pieces of the puzzle to be in place for it to work, or to start moving the needle just a little bit. So in terms of the international trends, you'll also see that this idea of just putting data in front of people, the right tech at the right time, doesn't always lead to results. And there's so much more research around this decision-making way of working that's coming out. And that's something we're addressing on DDD. So from a data-driven districts or triple-D perspective, I can talk about the data we're collecting. I believe it's a program that's collecting the most data at a systemic scale in basic education in South Africa. But it's definitely not the only source. Curriculum officials have their own sources of data that they collect. Almost every directorate has requests from schools to collect data through surveys or other systems. So there is a lot being collected. What I can speak to is what's being collected within the SASAM's world, which is the software that most schools use to manage their schools. And it includes data on educators, their attendance, their qualifications, the subjects they teach. It includes information on learners, how they perform in subjects, tasks that they complete according to CAPS policy, their attendance, some background information on learners. It includes information on schools, how schools are performing across the grades. So you can really slice and dice around school performance, learner trends, etc. And that's what we collect on, or that's what we use on the DDD program. But within SASAMS, there's other modules around infrastructure, finance, learning and training material. There's a lot of management information that's in there. So that data is being collected at a school level. Where we come and add value is we aggregate that up. So we've created some software tools that allow schools to submit that data electronically to our app, to our platform. Then we aggregate that information. So now a circuit manager can have access to that type of information around learners or educators or school performance without going to the school or without requesting an email of all of this data. Often it's not data you can email directly for all of their 15, 25, 30 schools at home. So they're just simply having access to that information is already a massive value add. And then further to that, we will start visualizing it so it's easier to interpret. We bring in some insights around the trends that we're picking up. But essentially, we're just adding value on top of a lot of this data that's being collected at the school level. An interesting insight from our side is that when we started bringing the solution to schools and the different district officials, the data that was being collected started to improve, like the data quality and completeness, because we brought a reason for using it. I think before DDD, some schools used it depending on whether they needed it and for reporting purposes and compliance and things like that. But there was a little push, there was a little flow back to the schools or flow back to other officials. So when we brought a reason for now taking every data point seriously in SASAMS, we saw that completeness start to increase quite quickly. And so the big takeaway there was when you bring in a purpose, you then see the behaviors around data submissions and data use improve. If we went in and said, well, people aren't really using SSAMs completely, or the modules aren't that nice, and there's some incomplete data there, and we can't do this with that, we wouldn't have gotten to where we are. So that's a big takeaway from us. But yeah, there is a lot being collected at the school level. More can be collected, for sure, if you bring in that purpose. And yeah, we're operating in all of the provinces, except Western Cape, which has a different system. But the coverage on the Triple D platform is above 90% for all schools using SSAMs. So it also brings that value to different officials, is that you have a nice sort of view of the land in front of you, and that everyone's speaking from the same source of truth. You know, no one has access, everyone is allowed access, it's free, it's their data. It is an internal system, so no one outside of the department can access it. But you now have access to the same view at the same time. It's not hearsay, it's not different sources. Even if you disagree on what's there, you have a starting point and a more effective conversation. And yeah, the value we've seen is around the learners, the educators. Yeah, I think the different directorates see different value in it. And we've specifically focused on what we believe is the outcome data, the more important data, which is learner performance, school performance, and educators' information. But I'm happy to answer. I've probably only covered a fifth of what DDD does and collects.
That's fantastic, though. That's really encouraging to know that there is an enormous amount of data being collected and that the quality of it is increasing continually as it's used. And I think that speaks to many of the points that we've brought up already around capacity and around usage. And yeah, that's interesting. I think that takes me to my next question, my next point, though. And Jeff, you're welcome to pop in here, or James, maybe if you feel that this is right for you. What role can data play in improving access to and the quality of education? And I'm also thinking about our sort of well-known issue in this country around dropout rates, and how can data be used to mitigate against that?
I can maybe go first, Catherine. Jeff, if it's okay. Shafika, have you got load shedding? Looks like
yes. I also look better in the dark.
Maybe just
and I'll come in after you,
okay.
You and Jeff on this as well. Please go ahead, Jim.
I'll be quick. Catherine, I think, you know, we can do a lot of fantastic stuff with data, but actually my response to you would be, we need to get the basics right. We need to get our young kids to read properly for meaning. So I think while we can do a lot of magic and a lot of interesting things in our country with better data, and Triple D is such a good example of what can be done, I think just basic good teaching at a primary level is actually, you know, something we really as a country need to focus on. And you guys at Latasa would be very familiar with the trends and the data around this. I think just good teachers, and I know this is not the answer you want from me, but I think just getting the basics right, good teaching at early grade levels, good reading, good writing kind of stuff is what I would answer you on. But let me leave it there. Let's hear from the others.
Maybe can I jump in there as well, is to say, I think many people in this situation wonder how we get from here to there, if you know what I mean. How do we get from needing basic numeracy and literacy to be strong to being competitive in a knowledge economy that's so data driven? I think that's a question that we would really like to look at, particularly at our conference. Yeah, so I hear you, but I'm also wondering, how do we not always lag behind? Yeah, but others, Shafika, I think.
Can I quickly come in there, Jeff? So I think that outside of the state, and I think James has raised quite a number, and Jeff, a number of very good examples of the use of data that is publicly owned by the state. But we also know that there are a number of actors in the educational technology space that also, through the solutions that they have to offer, are also getting access to quite useful data as well that can point more precisely. And here's the thing, the technologies that are coming on stream in terms of learning analytics, in terms of technologies that allow for prediction and tracking of children and young people dropping out of school, offer huge possibilities. So there's an example in India where Microsoft has, for example, partnered with the Indian government to invest in a tracking system for children who are at risk of dropping out of school, quite successfully in terms of finding indicators and predictors of early dropout, so that there can be timeliest interventions with teachers and the schooling ecosystem to support learners and prevent dropout from happening in the first place. So there are a number of good examples where even at the level of literacy and numeracy, where learning analytics have played a role in terms of identifying more precisely per learner at quite an individual and personalized way some of the challenges that learners face in terms of reading with comprehension and what are the specific topics and issues that they are challenged with. So those are in fact the affordances that the technologies have to offer. But at the same time, there are also a whole host of other very deep-seated and real concerns about the fact that the data that is harvested also profiles learners in a particular way, can also reinforce the kinds of marginalization of learners that we see within a sort of a performative framing, you know, and also how the data that is being harvested, how that is stored and used, and gaining control over that. So that is still quite a fundamental issue which we need to address. There are a number of fantastic, as you would know, mobile reading apps, for example, you know, that can do wonders in terms of supporting learners to engage with their challenges with phonics, etc. But again, what there isn't a coherent response to is how do we ensure that the data that is harvested, that emanate from those technological products, how that is managed in a way that doesn't infringe upon the privacy of the children that are actually using those results. And I think that that's the important conversation as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll share some lessons learned from the Triple D program around success or how we got to where we are. And hopefully that also helps others understand, you know, how they can get success out of tech and data initiatives that they run. So what's made the Triple D program successful, without a doubt, is collaboration. So we have funders funding it, so there has to be the resources put towards the initiative, both in terms of tech and implementation. Then buy-in and support from all stakeholders involved. For example, if you talk about a reading app, it can't just be that child. It has to also be the parents or educators, or the people building the tech have to be involved and collaborate in order for it to really be an effective tool. And so we've experienced a lot of collaboration from the DBE, from the provincial departments, you know, not just the users of the information, but even support from EMIS, for example, around rolling the program out. And that would only happen if they buy into the idea of being more data-driven, if they understand the benefits, if they come to the party. So collaboration has definitely been an important factor in the success of DDD. And then, you know, back to the initial point by Shafika, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a powerful tool. If you don't have a willing and able educator matched to a willing and able learner, data is not going to solve that. It's only going to make the learning that is taking place far more effective. It's only going to make the decisions by circuit managers or curriculum officials more efficient, more effective, whether it's saving costs or using the limited resources and time you have for bigger impact. But it cannot replace experts, you know, not anytime soon at least. Tech can help weaker students catch up, or more effort go towards the schools that need more effort rather than allowing schools that are high performing to continue. So it's about decision making, it's about using the limited resources at your disposal to their best use. Data absolutely can help with that, but it cannot replace major dysfunctionalities. It's not that type of silver bullet, but yet still extremely powerful. I've ignored sort of what we've done on DDD around data privacy, etc., for the question when it comes up. But yeah, there's also a lot I want to add there, because that's a massive caveat across all the conversations that we have. It's, you know, when you start talking about early warning systems, which we have introduced on DDD, there are these trade-offs and risks that you have to think about. Like, how do you manage that? What about a school that hasn't submitted data to the DDD program, or a school that doesn't have connectivity? Are they now being disadvantaged because they are not part of the data set? Fortunately, we have really extensive coverage, and it's still benefiting the circuit managers, the curriculum officials that support those schools. But in a case where it's, you know, these learning type of apps, absolutely, you know, these other schools don't have access to this. So are you doing them, you know, is it widening that gap? And you always have to think about that and surface it. You know, if you don't surface it, then, you know, you can have learners that, or schools that drop off, and you don't want that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to pick up on your point around the use of this data to drive policy decisions and that kind of decision making. And I'm thinking about the research aspect of data, using this data for research purposes or for, yeah, kind of generating a data-informed policy. What are the ethical challenges there of government or an external organization using that data for research purposes, or to use it to generate findings that policy is then based on? What are the ethical challenges there?
Again, I can speak from DDD. So the sort of mission of the Triple D program is not really aligned to research. It's more around the day-to-day decision-making of officials at a provincial, specifically district, and then school level. So it's focused on providing data insights, actionable data insights to those sort of on the ground doing the work. However, obviously the data we're collecting from all of these SSAMS databases has massive potential for research purposes, but it's not really a core focus of our work. So what we have done in the past and recently is made these data sets available to researchers that have requested the data to ensure safety of data and compliance. It's done through the department, and it's always done with anonymized data. So, you know, in fact, everyone on the program that's running this program doesn't have access to learner information. You know, we're fully POPI compliant and beyond, because POPI compliance, yes, is important, but you've got to think about the processes and other protocols that you know, bring in risks. So when we share data for research purposes, you know, it's anonymized, it's POPI compliant, and it's gone through all the existing research protocols by the Department of Education. So I think that's important to know. It's actually very difficult to access this data if you're not an education official at the moment. And then even harder to get learner names. The way we approach it is the only users that have access to learner or educator names are officials that already have access to that information, right? So that's how we manage that risk. But absolutely, you know, this information can be made available to research houses if they go through the right protocols and processes. We've seen recently some very interesting research done around educator ages, or the age of educators, and how we have this cohort of educators that are about to retire quite soon. and what does that have, what implications that has for the department around budgets, both on a positive and negative side. We've seen research on the impact of now longitudinal data. So a lot of data in the education space is very much that term, that year. But if you're able to start linking it over time, you can start to generate more accurate throughput rates, understand really where learners are dropping off, or are they dropping off? They might just be going to another school. And what you think are large dropout rates are actually just migration trends. You can start accommodating for that through these longitudinal data trends. But we leave that kind of research, policy work to the department. We have, it's their data. They have access to this information, and they've reached out to us a few times for support on that. The policy and research units there, and obviously the sort of university research houses. Speaking as the innovation and insights manager, we focus more on, as a curriculum official, what information, what data point or insight do you need on this day to help you solve this specific challenge or problem that you need to address? It's sort of a different lens to data-driven decision-making than to data informing policy. So I hope that sort of brings in a bit of a picture around the difference.
It's very encouraging, again, to see. But I wonder, I think James, this picks up on your point around the siloed nature of data collection. And it seems that a lot is being collected, but the parts are not talking to one another. And I wonder what possibilities you see for collecting data and for there to be greater collaboration between the silos using various forms of data to improve quality and access to education.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, Catherine, because I mean, this is, if we knew the answer, we'd probably be in a better place. I think Triple D set a good example, Jeff, you and the team, of it can be done in a partnership. Jeff, again, your point, between government and private funders and bringing the technical capacity, Catherine. I think we've been trying to do a lot of work with SETA, the State Information Technology Agency, the last couple of years. And I'm telling you, it's not been a good experience. So the capacity in government is very low, and the privacy laws are becoming very cumbersome. And I'm not complaining, because I think it's important we have POPI and all of these kind of things. But actually what you find is a low capacity and absolutely no access. So you actually in a kind of just a dead end if you want to work with government data. And Triple D has actually been able to break that open, and credit to Triple D. But I think back to my earlier point, Catherine, we can have a lot of debates about data and the use of data in primary school, early grade reading, and so on. Go back to my point. I think these discussions are more valuable for me in the PSET and the post-school sector, where you've got universities, colleges, unemployed youth, and so on, where at the bottom end, I would continue advocating for getting the basics right. Because whatever fancy stuff we use at the bottom end, our country is sitting in the dark, most of us. And we're talking about apps and tools and these kind of things. And I'm just like, guys, train the teachers properly, get them in schools, make sure that they're monitored and that they're accountable. And we can do the fancy stuff later in their lives. Let's just get the basics right first. Thanks.
Thank you. Shafika, can I maybe ask you, is this process or this kind of context overseas or internationally, is it driven by governments really working with partners and with business to work with data in education, or is it generally a collaboration between business and or private enterprises and government?
So Catherine, I think that it operates at a number of levels. I think there's a lot that is coming and is being driven also by international governments, intergovernmental agencies like in the UN system, like the UNESCO's and the UNICEF's, in collaboration with the World Bank and so on, in terms of framing from a policy perspective, from an approach perspective, providing guidelines on how to engage on these very complex issues. So I think a lot of how we begin to address these issues is coming from those quarters. And we've seen a plethora, I mean, I've been part of a few of them, a plethora of guidelines and frameworks. There's an AI in education for policymakers guidelines, and there's guidelines on data education in education. And there's now, just in November last year, UNESCO has just passed a recommendation on AI and AI frameworks and decision-making. And I think that that is quite a milestone in terms of providing ethical frameworks of engaging with artificially intelligent systems. So there's a lot coming conceptually and in terms of ideas, in terms of how to design policy in public systems like the education system on these very vexing and very challenging issues. A lot of that is also coming from big tech, because we have in fact seen a massive growth of the edtech sector. You know, I mean, I don't have the figures right now, but in Africa alone, we know that there's something like 12% compound annual growth rate of the edtech sector. We've got something like 300 different edtech startups in South Africa alone. And the market capitalization in the edtech space runs into the billions, and it's growing quite substantially year on year. So a lot of impetus is also coming from big tech in the engagements, and we see it a lot more in the university space. You know, the engagements of the private sector and how they're engaging with universities. And I think James can talk a lot more about that, given that he works in that space a lot more. But and so at the same time, also national governments are under huge pressure to meet the goals of the SDGs. And there is an attraction to exploring, almost an imperative to explore what can the technologies do to help us address you know, the educational challenges. So yes, I do think that it is taking the form of powerful partnerships and power networks operating in the space between governments, intergovernmental organizations, and big tech companies and edtech startups and venture capitalists working in the space. And there's almost a whole fascinating almost infrastructure and ecosystem emerging, which you know, some researchers are referring to it as meta edtech. You know, just the entire, if one just looks at what's happening globally in this space as well. So there's a lot of impetus coming at a number of quarters in terms of answering that question. And again, I think we are confronted with the need to look at how can we utilize it in a way that deals with the fundamental challenges, the basic challenges. It is always ironic that I'm always asked to talk about the fourth industrial revolution when I'm sitting in the dark and we haven't sorted out the basic, you know, infrastructural issues of electricity, you know. So the reality therefore is that we have approaches that we can work with in terms of engaging with the contradictions and with the challenges, as well as exploring ways that can in fact begin to address the fundamental problem of deepening inequality in our system that is compounded by pandemics and floods in KZN and you know, insurrectionary movements and state capture and all of that. So that's quite a toxic cocktail that we are dealing with also in the education system, and that does demand collaboration beyond the boundaries that we are working with. So we've got to engage with other sectors, the health sector, the agricultural sector, the policing system, the social development system, if we are going to be able to address these issues holistically. And therein lies the challenge. The need to step beyond our silos is an incredibly hard thing to do. But it is the only way in order to address some of the big capacity challenges we have in our system. We've got to look at ways to confront our siloed mentalities and work with different mental models to confront some of the challenges we're facing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I would ask, so I'm sure anybody sitting here listening to this is just feeling completely overwhelmed. You know, this seems like such a large challenge, and I'm just one person. To any of you, how do people make sense of this flourishing edtech space and the number of players, and feeling that they, you know, where is my place as an individual in this large system? That's one question. How can they address that, or how can they empower themselves? And then I think my related question is then around the data privacy and data sovereignty issues, how can we empower ourselves to know what our rights are, who we should be going to when we feel that our data is being used incorrectly, or, you know, and to find out where this data is stored and how it's being used?
I can have a quick go, Catherine. I think we need to look at the governance of data platforms and new forms of governance that are, you know, we've for many years, many decades spoken about P, public-private partnerships. What we're seeing in our platform work at the moment is a kind of new form of that, which we refer to as CC by P, citizen, civil society, public-private partnerships, where you have governance mechanisms that include civil society, that include citizens, and then the government and the private sector. And these governance models are new. They're also sometimes referred to as decentralized autonomous organizations. And these are the models that we're seeing getting traction internationally around managing the big interoperable data platforms that include both private and public data. And so if you don't work in this space, you might think like, oh, crikey, you know, to start a whole lot of acronyms. But the reality is there's some really interesting work happening in this space in South Africa, in Malta, in the European Union, and in other parts of the world. And we're part of those debates. Unfortunately, a small community in South Africa. And I think it's time that we broaden that discussion and allow more people into it to understand it and to engage with it. But there are some exciting things happening, Catherine, around governance of data platforms. And I think that could be one of the answers to your question.
That's great. That's interesting. Shafika looked like she said she wanted to say something. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to also look at what is coming out from organizations like the UN. I thought that the conversations around the future of education, the call for a new social contract document that the UN has just released, UNESCO has just released, raises some very useful ideas and points that we need to be mobilizing around. Things like reclaiming education as a public good, strategies to keep big tech accountable, making the case continuously still for the value and the importance of schools in the face of calls that we don't need schools, you know, because of the emergence of virtual schooling and people can learn from home and, you know, learning via virtual platforms, etc. And so those fundamental issues are being revisited, and it is important that we open up those conversations in these spaces. And so therefore, I think to educate ourselves and our community, we need a lot more of these discussions, and particularly to talk about strategies, because we're all groping in the dark, actually, because the issues are so complex. And therefore, it becomes imperative that we create spaces for debate, for discussion, and so on, and that we initiate those. A crucial part of this, by the way, is also to recognize that children and young people are incredibly creative and insightful and have agency. And I've actually learned most when there were youth forums and forums of children where they lead the conversations around issues of AI and how to address challenges that they are facing with incredible insight. And so this notion that it's only an adult conversation also has to be debunked. Because the youth are asking for a seat at the table. In fact, they're claiming it. And we should, in fact, create spaces where young voices who have more creative insights need to be leading us and enable spaces that allow them to develop their agency is also an important part of that conversation. And I think Litasa is making a good start, and we would encourage you to have more of these, actually, to to make sense of how do we begin to tackle these very complex issues.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And maybe, Jeff, I can bring you in again on the data issue, because we are playing with the data that belongs to these young people, and they're going to have to live with the consequences of it. So I think I completely hear Shafika when she says that they should have a seat at the table because it's their information. Let's come back to those points about data. And can you share around Triple D and the data issues that you've dealt with there? Data security, I should say, yeah, and privacy.
Sure. I can maybe just to touch on the previous issue around all of this complexity and all of this data, overwhelming concepts. But I think the approach that we take on the Triple D program is like, don't let the data, don't be drowned by all these insights, don't be drowned by all the data or all the tech. Remain focused on what your core strategy is. If it's improving performance of underperforming, under-resourced schools that are have less access to what more urban schools have access to, if that's your strategy, look for tech that addresses that, or think about the data insights that address that. Make data work for your strategy. Don't make data and tech be your strategy. You will then get overwhelmed and sort of lost along the way. So have a problem statement, have a research question, and then use data to start sort of answering that question or helping you inform on whether you're on the right track or not. That often really narrows down everything and makes it a little bit more simple and easier to then start going on this data-driven journey, and then be very clear that, am I just going to use this data for reporting, or am I actually willing to still take serious decisions and follow through on them when the data insights come back in certain forms? That all goes back to what James and Shafika are referring to as the fundamentals. Yeah. But a different approach might make it a little bit easier to understand and start the journey, as opposed to sitting in a cockpit of an airplane and not knowing what all the buttons do. It's overwhelming and you don't know where to start, and sort of not actually useful. I think in terms of Triple D and how we've managed access and all of that is obviously, I think almost every year we've had external evaluations around the security of tech, making sure that it meets and exceeds any sort of government requirements, standards that are already in place. That's sort of the baseline that you want to do. But that's on the tech side. On the people side, which is often harder, you then have to look at existing processes, what is in the department, and plug in to that as much as possible so that you are compliant and you're not making it harder or adding in new processes, right? So plugging into the department and how they want to operate and how they operate is important. And then limiting access to sensitive information as defined by POPI, which is the sort of added burden, but extremely helpful when you start implementing processes that make you POPI compliant. It really starts to make sense. So like by default, no one has access to learner names or educator names. No one by default has access to contact information, because it's really around spamming people and stealing identities, right? So you try and you play this balancing game of enough insights, but you cannot steal someone's identity, or you cannot start contacting them outside of what they have agreed to. So users have agreed to, send me information about new data that's on the dashboard and new features. That's fine. It's part of business. You're allowed to do that. But we cannot send marketing material for something that's not DDD related. And so it's bringing in those processes and then awareness with our users. A lot of people are concerned about POPI, so that helps us. Whenever we talk about data security, like, everyone listens. And everyone is aware that they need to be careful with this information. But on top of that, we can also highlight the risks and explain certain things that people can still do and you need to be aware of. But yeah, you know, you can always take a picture of a PC screen with your phone. You know, no matter what tech you bring in or what processes you bring in, if there is intention to be negligent on an individual basis, whether you have access to DDD or other systems, you know, the SSAM system, other data that's collected, there's always that risk. It's more around the processes and the policies that you have in place to reduce that, and then what you do if there is a breach or if there is an accidental or intentional breach. But yeah, it's sort of on top of our minds all the time because we deal and manage a lot of sensitive data. You know, classified as high-risk data by POPI itself.
Yeah, it's a minefield. It's complex, isn't it? I wonder.
Yeah. So it's complex and often burdensome, but that is what's required when you deal with sensitive data. It shouldn't be very simple and easy and quick to do. Some things are. If you're an official, you can get access to DDD, but then you have limited access. And to really get, you really have to make a case for why you need access to learner information or sensitive information, and then go through the processes, the approvals, and all of that before you can have access to it. And then that is also time bound and audited quite frequently by the Auditor General. So we get involved in that too.
I'm thinking also of sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. So we've been speaking today a lot about the end, you know, collecting data and the output that comes with that. But I'm thinking about children actually sitting in a classroom using tech and the safety online and safety that teachers, that schools, that you know, tech IT people working in schools need to put in place to keep those children safe. And I'm thinking that there's a capacity issue there, and there's also perhaps from a literacy perspective, that's a really interesting moment for me in terms of media and information literacy skills that need to be developed there. Yeah, so Shafika, I see you nodding. Tell us more.
Yes, no, I mean, it is a fundamental problem, right? So the lack of awareness, the profound lack of awareness amongst our teachers when they use some of the technologies in the classroom around issues of data privacy. I mean, there was a campaign called Know Your Cookie, you know, so that kids can understand how when just saying yes to cookies, it can also open up insights into their private data. And so the point around there's been some campaigns around the importance of media and information literacy, critical literacy, digital literacies, data literacy, and we're not doing enough of that. And perhaps the way to address this would be to not do some separate literacy training, but maybe to integrate it into existing training programs. So with Litasa having teacher training programs on literacy issues to integrate issues of data literacy and media and information literacy as part of that teacher development programs. And I think we're learning how to integrate these issues when we do when we design various interventions in the system like that. But that's certainly a big core. The other is also to create awareness about what agency individuals and groups do have in terms of learning to understand and know the products that you are working with and what you are giving away. And I don't think we do enough of that. So if you're doing Reading Eggs, or you're working with Class Dojo, or you're working with whatever app, but do you know what data that app is collecting? Do we all know? We don't really ask those questions, you know. So I think part of that is also know the products, know the companies who are involved, who is behind these products. And very importantly, I think the idea that Jeff raised about their approach in DDD around anonymizing the data of children so that there isn't access to the private data of learners is another very important approach that we could adopt. That's part of a broader media and information literacy, critical literacies program that we need. And there have been, I mean, I know that we hosted a big MIL, Media and Information Literacy Conference that the Department of Basic Education hosted last year. But then it's just another conference, you know. The idea is really to get organizations and people possibly in this meeting to initiate workshops and programs that can address these issues. And I think that's really the call. There are toolkits, there are frameworks available that we can just use for integrating these programs into existing programs. And I actually think that would be the way to go going forward. Yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah. And I think I would really love to see that this be taken into consideration in future curricula, because I don't think it's something that's going to be going away. And I don't think that it's dealt with adequately or space made for it. But again, that's a capacity issue. Are teachers feeling comfortable with information and media literacy, data literacy, all of that kind of thing? Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, we are coming towards the end of our panel discussion. I'm sure all our participants are very keen to ask questions, and I've seen many messages and reports flying around in the chat, which is excellent. Please continue to do that, and please add in any questions that you'd like me to direct to the speakers. I think the last sort of area that I'd like to look at specifically around literacy programs, I think we've touched on them now. But I'm thinking of often the challenges that we face in South Africa in terms of literacy programs, analog or offline ones, are the issues of African languages being so different to English in the way that we teach it, or parts of it being so different, around adequate texts and using the right kind of text and it being relevant to local audiences. And I think the challenge that we face with using a lot of proprietary software from overseas is that it doesn't fulfill those requirements. And we almost have to fit South African children into an American or a US or a UK or, you know, Australian system rather than the other way around. And I think this comes back to the capacity issue. And Shafika, I hear you telling us that there are so many hundreds of edtech startups in this country. How do we deal with, you know, almost, I don't want to say competing, but how do we compete with the enormous resources and power that they have to produce excellent material that can offer personalized learning, because it can match ability levels and move children up with the resources and the capacity that we have in this country?
You know, I think we've got to think very carefully about how do we mobilize the pedagogues, the educationists in this space, because a lot of the products are designed by techies. And if we are looking at addressing literacy challenges and African languages, then I think organizations like Litasa could play a role in engaging in, you know, making calls for engaging with these edtech startups, because I think the answer lies in the engagement rather than the rejection or the toying against them. I think it is a question of engagement, but it does involve mobilizing and ensuring that we rally behind the centrality of the pedagogical considerations in our relative contexts in South Africa, from Lusikisiki to Zitulele to Diepsloot, you know. And often the products aren't designed by people who get those contexts and also who understand learning and literacy learning and teaching. And so I think that maybe part of the way we need to approach this is what I'm calling, let's mobilize the pedagogues. Let's get the educational interests to be foregrounded so that we can address the fundamental challenge that, you know, the 78% of 10-year-olds can't read for meaning, but that we engage with that in a very robust way. And maybe that's the way to do that, because it's been too much of a lament about the dominance of the techies in the space. But then we've got to do something about it. And maybe that's the approach that we need to, and maybe we could start with the stuff that we know, or the products that are already out there, And so many of the research that's coming out is making a call for the engagements with the developers, making the developers accountable. And I think in South Africa, perhaps that approach is the way to go, to also then mobilize the resources that are at our disposal. You know, we're aware of state incapacity and challenges and constraints, but there's also capacity outside of the state, and mobilizing the non-state actors that James has been talking about. Maybe that's also part of the equation. And also mobilizing the VCs, the venture capitalists who sit behind the startups, you know. And so therefore really looking at the partner ecosystem, so that we can say, well, we do want every 10-year-old to be able to read for meaning in any language. How do we get that to happen, and how can we mobilize the affordances of technologies to make that happen? And so it does mean that we also challenge the existing power relations around, you know, the EdTech dominance and the tech dominance in these spaces. Yeah.
Wow, that's stirring. I feel like I should go out and do it, which is excellent. Yeah. I'm thinking also around EGRA. I wonder, Jeff, do you see a space in the role that Triple D plays where we can begin to use Triple D or a system like it to help with tracking, for example, benchmarks in African languages and the data that we're collecting from EGRA at school level, that we can almost be able to, people could use Triple D to see where a child is in comparison to those benchmarks, and then use that information for classroom instruction and adjusting it and assessment as well.
Yeah, look, I'm not a literacy expert, but I do understand the early grade reading sort of project and some of the metrics that they are trying to collect or are collecting through more of a research-based process. But again, yes, you can visualize any data. You can create benchmarks, trends, baselines. You can build in automatic notifications if a certain data point hits a threshold, and you can, you know, there's so much you can do. I think you're sort of getting to that point where I'm getting to, and that is, what do you want to do with it? What is the what is the purpose or the use case for this information? And do you need every school to submit this information and make it available to everyone to have that impact? Or is it a specific subset of individuals? What is the data point? Who needs to know that data point, and when? What opportunities for scale are there? Do you need to scale that big? So it all goes back to what is the data point? Can you collect that data? Is it being collected? I do think there is something there around, if the EGRA metrics can be standardized and collected in a way that's more digital and then aggregated, the right people could be informed of those that need more support, as opposed to trying to support everyone the same. Again, back to using the resources you have more effectively. I think that information can help. But there's always this sort of initial view that when this data begins to be collected, like, let's try and collect all of it, aggregate it, visualize it, build out trends. But that's not always the best place to go. Rather go slow, think about that one decision, or what sort of interventions are in place. How can those interventions map to the right people? What is that data point? Who needs that data point? And just focus on that. I think there is potential there. But as was mentioned previously, you have to have the fundamentals in place. You have to have those, the best, even if you had an entire dashboard just for EGRA, if you don't have the underlying capacity there to respond to those insights, interpret those insights, access those insights, be responsible for the data coming out of that, then it wouldn't necessarily work. So yes, it would help. And I think there's some real cool potential there. So it's very exciting, especially if it can plug into SASAMs. There's great opportunities there, but it's only one small piece of the puzzle. We also have to make sure the other pieces are there.
Get the fundamentals right. Yeah. James, can I finish off with you and just look at higher education and say, or ask you, what potential do you see there for personalized learning or for making courses tailored to individuals through the use of data and data tracking and personalized learning?
Maybe I can give an example, Catherine, that people can look at. It's called the PSET Cloud. So PSET cloud.org.za. It's a national initiative underway led by MERCETA, the Manufacturing Engineering CETA, and it involves DHET and many other government players. And what we're trying to do there is do exactly what you say. So we're trying to set up a national platform that allows interoperable data to be fed into it using APIs, automatic program interfaces, so that we can start answering some of the questions around learning pathways, around individual learning pathways, but also around the credentialing. So the PSET Cloud then also links with the SAQA and the Umulusi systems to allow real-time verification of those pathways. And the pathway will always include formal and non-formal learning. So the formal learning is a bit easier to, I suppose, recognize and authenticate, and the non-formal learning a little bit more complicated, but it can be done. I think we live in a world now where the technology enables us to do these individualized learning pathways in an authentic, credible, verifiable manner. But our problem is when we've got a weak schooling system, we can do all the magic up there, but what we're getting into the universities is very weak. So there's a concrete example, Catherine, that people can look at.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, we have a few minutes left for questions. So I'm just going to have a little scroll through. I think a lot of discussion has been happening in the chat area as we've been talking. But if there are perhaps specific questions that anybody would like to ask that I can pass on to our speakers, please put those in now, and I will pass that on. I see a point from Magali. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. She came back to my point about dropouts in South Africa, and she says she thinks that there's an important dimension of this in the invisibility of a learner, especially those in large classes and very large classes. Children in a 40 to 60 kids class may feel drowned in the mass, and it can be really hard for teachers to connect with them. When they experience, say, a family tragedy, they may be tempted to miss school and nobody will notice. So once there is access to data and a culture of teachers or school management to go and check absenteeism trends at a single learner level, then educators can reach out to those individual children and or their families and understand what is happening for a particular child. Once that understanding is happening, support can be provided for a child who can then be brought back into the space of learning. And I think that's very much the message that's come through, is what is the purpose of collecting that data, and then how is it being used? And if it's for supporting like that, then that's excellent. If it's just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, then what's the point? It doesn't serve its purpose. Yeah. Okay.
Can I give a concrete example to that question around dropouts? With data, it's never fact, right? Any early warning systems, any forecasts, predictions is based on probabilities. So data is powerful, but it's not always 100%. In fact, it's very seldom 100% accurate. You still need experts to interpret and then act based on their knowledge and experience on that information. One thing that we did on Triple D is we looked at weekly attendance of learners. And what we found was learners don't typically just drop out. They sort of disengage and then drop out. And part of that is their absenteeism starts to increase. There's also policy implications around learners that are absent for consecutive number of days and all sorts of other regulations around it. So we said, okay, well, why don't we just flag learners who have all of a sudden become absent beyond a certain threshold, and just say, these are the learners. And I think when we spoke to a principal, he was saying how helpful it was just to receive an email to say, based on the most recent data you submitted, there are these 5 learners that were absent for 4 or more days last week. we can't say that they're about to drop out, or we can't say that if you don't do anything, they're going to drop out. But we can say, this is just what the data is saying. This is why we're sharing it with you. And the principal found that very helpful because there are a lot of learners in the school. It's always great to have this reminder around following up on these learners. Sometimes he knew what was the reason before even looking at the data. Other times he had to follow up and make sure that other educators in the school departmental heads knew that this was happening. At the same time, because of our user base, we can also share that same information with the circuit manager linked to that circuit. So they can also ensure that the right policies and protocols are taking place for these learners. And that's a very powerful example around how data, even if the school didn't have access to the dashboard but was submitting data, could be supported by others in the department. It's raising awareness around this, but you're never going to get it 100% accurate. But you can facilitate the right conversations, the right follow-up, and the right next steps through these sort of automatic notifications.
I really appreciate your point earlier as well around migration, that there might be a slip there and the person hasn't actually dropped out, they've just moved somewhere else, but maybe they were just not picked up across the system. So that's a really helpful use, yeah. She goes on to say, Jeff, I really appreciate your point about checking the capacity to respond to the insights that will be surfaced by the data. And she'd love to chat to you more about that. And the journey of accompanying the users of data. I think we all would, quite frankly, and I think Shafika has unfortunately spurred me on to think about how we can have more discussions around how to build capacity in this area and how to be asking the right questions. I think that's what we need to be doing, yeah. Sophia says, it's building a culture and data-driven mindset is key. No matter how good or accessible the systems, the impact of that depends on educators' appetite and ability to use that. And it's that same capacity building. And I think if they can see, all of us can see demonstrations of its use, I think that makes it relevant to everyone. Yeah. Peter asks, Jeff, do you know what percentage of principals have registered on the DDD and what percentage look at the data regularly?
Yeah, so to that question, we do track usage by the type of individual accessing it. So we do have thousands of principals who access DDD and sort of log in and use it. We don't always have line of sight of what they're using that information for. I think it's also important to know that at a school level, schools have SASAMs. So the information we visualize or present on the DDD dashboard is the same information, probably less than what they have already on the ground. So it's not that critical that or it doesn't imply that if a principal is not using DDD, that they're not data driven. They have their SASAMs at the school. But we have a lot of feedback from principals that say they appreciate how we've packaged the data. It's different to what they see out of SASAM's reports, but it is essentially the same information. We do track which reports they download, so we can get a sense of what they're using DDD for. It might be a lot of educator-related reports, or it might be a lot of learner performance or submissions, etc. But again, just because they're downloading those reports, we can't make the assumption that they are now solving a learner absenteeism issue. It might just be for reporting, but we do track that information.
Right, thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question, if possible. I see that there's a question around whether the presentation is going to be available as a recording. It will indeed. We have been recording this session. So I see Neil would like to ask a question, but Neil, I can see if I can unmute you. Let's give it a go. You're very lucky, Neil.
Hi there.
Hi.
You can hear me. Hi. Yes, there's actually a couple of things. Sorry, I really enjoyed this this session this evening, and a couple of things. One is engage versus reject. Shafika, you raised that point. That is insanely important as far as we are concerned. James, you highlighted another point about getting the basics right. We can talk at length about the physical, the physical space versus the digital space, but none of that really matters if we don't just get those basics right and listen to what each person has to contribute. And in a South African context, I'm fully aware in our little space as library resource service providers, doing this for almost 21 years now. When I joined, there was speak of, the white papers and the green papers and all of those sort of things about policy being implemented. Fast forward, there's still nothing of a day old. So that's part of the problem, but how do we're collaborating, and there's a lot of collaboration that's happening out there. And there are entities out there that are trying their best to provide the product that is necessary for our children to have access to, but there's a block in terms of the child having access. And part of that is your LTSM space not allowing new material to be given breathing room, to be given an opportunity to be showcased. It's the same old, and I'm not going to knock international companies or anything of that sort, but being in the trenches, there are so many local publishers that are trying their best to get material in the, available in the vernacular. We started as we're supplying international resources. Then you move on to, there's no libraries in school, so let's start with mobile libraries. Then, okay, we need to go into the vernacular. So you start publishing. So you try and you adapt as you go along. Now we are in the digital space. So you create a digital platform. You try what you can. It all comes out of your own pocket. What you need is somebody to listen to what it is that you are trying to apply and introduce as a value add. And that's incredibly important, because there's a space, there's an opportunity for everything, but those basics need to be gotten right. And yourselves, I mean, the Shafikas, James, Jeff, you guys are the professionals in your particular fields. And we need to get to a point where the teachers are adequately equipped to be able to offload. They're the people that impart the tools to our children. Our children, they need to have access to the quality resources. And that seems to be where the problem is, because we can produce all the best stuff in the world and it means nothing until there's an opportunity for the child to be able to make use of it. And part of that is fun. We need to somehow bring a fun element back into the lives of our children, especially in the South African dynamic. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of mountains to climb and circumstances. And we just want the children to be able to have fun, to access quality resources with the support of communities, parents, teachers, allowing them and enabling them. And part of that is a mind shift in terms of how we're going to go about it. And I think that's where the digital space comes in. And, and Jeff, with what you were sharing there, I'm one of those guys. I'm a user, and that's the limit of my expertise. But in terms of the data, the mining, the stuff that's available out there, it's incredibly important and potent in terms of how we can apply that to work and go forward, and not say, you know what, today is not a digital day, today's a this day. We need to embrace all of that, and there's different horses for different courses, and in that way we'll be able to reach everybody, not simultaneously, and that's a reality. We can't do everything for everyone at this stage, but there's enough people trying out there and holding hands, but it comes down to engage versus reject. Listen to what everyone's strong point is and how that can fit into that big wheel. Everyone's got a cog, and that's what keeps the wheel turning, because not everyone is a specialist service provider, a trainer, a teacher, a mentor, etc. Sometimes it's a product, sometimes it's a this, but enabling a platform where South African service providers are allowed to showcase their wares, and Latasa is one of those opportunities. See you guys there. I'm staring at my invoice, and to pay it by Friday, by the way. But we need to share and collaborate and just listen to what everyone has to share, as opposed to banking it, because part of that is, and it's a big frustration, is they are the juggernauts of the world that come in and they just dominate, and they take over, and they their ways are implemented without a second thought. And I'm saying, like, that's a pity. What about all the other guys that are out there? So sorry, long story short, I just wanted to share that I resonate with everything that's being said there, and we need to have more platforms like this where we can share and engage more regularly.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you summed up many issues that many of us are dealing with. So yeah, any responses? We're going to finish in literally 2 minutes. And perhaps from our guests, our panel guests, just your closeout comment, any takeaway or any final thought that you'd like to leave with our guests today?
Can I go? Thanks for the opportunity, Catherine, and look forward to engaging with this community. I think there's a lot of exciting things in our country, and let's stay positive. There's a lot happening, but we also have the creativity and the resilience of South Africans and a strong civil society. Let's not give up. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yes, from my side too, very encouraged that we actually have people from the Eastern Cape and different provinces here, and also from as far as Ghana. It is a global conversation. It is a Pan-African conversation. And we definitely absolutely need to have a lot more, Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, from me, thank you for allowing me to share my views and thoughts and what we do on the Triple D program. It's a great privilege to also be a panel member with two other great panelists.
And I want to say thank you to our panelists. You've done an amazing job. Thank you for bringing yourselves and your work and your energies to this session today. It's hugely appreciated. I think you can see from the comments. Yeah, and just to all our participants, just a reminder that this was really a precursor to our conference, which is taking place in September, the 30th of September until the 2nd of October. It's up here in Joburg. So if you're here, you have no excuse. You need to be there. And the theme for this year's conference is Rethinking Literacy and Pedagogic Agency in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I think we're going to be picking up on a lot of these issues and many others to do with open educational resources and a wide range of issues. So we'd love to see you there. You can find out more via our website, which is latasa.org.za, and we have a conference tab, and you can find out. You can find the call for submissions. Unfortunately, those have closed already, but you're welcome to just join us as a participant, and you can register via our website as well. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to our panelists for a really thought-provoking discussion. I feel there's so many things that I want to go and find out now and learn about, and we just appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening, and we will see you again.